What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. About 2 months ago when Dynamic Queue first came out, Riot announced that they would also release a solo queue system that would be completely separate from Dynamic Queue and would limit you to only queuing solo, no duo queues at all this time around. When Dynamic Queue was released, there were plenty of significant issues like long queue times, imbalanced matchmaking, and teams being matched up against solo queuers. And so this idea of having a solo queue solved a lot of people's concerns with Dynamic Queue at the time, and Riot announced that it would be coming in the next few weeks. But it's been about 2 months since then, and of course solo queue hasn't been released yet. And I know I'm a little bit late to this topic because a couple of my friends already made videos on this, but I do think that my angle and opinion on this topic is really different, so let's get started. Now Riot published this statement a few days ago about solo queue, and in it they talked a lot about how the problems that Dynamic Queue had on launch have since been solved. And you gotta give them some credit there, they kind of have been, to be honest, especially the matchmaking, and that the Dynamic Queue system is also working really well so far, but there's still a few problems and they are working on improvements for them. Additionally, they mentioned that the reason why they haven't released solo queue yet is because they prioritized fixing Dynamic Queue first, and they did apologize and say that they should have mentioned that sooner. Then they concluded the post with this bomb and said that they're concerned with how solo queue will affect matchmaking as a whole, and they're assessing how they want to proceed. Now this is a really big red flag that points towards solo queue being cancelled altogether. Now they didn't say specifically that it's going to be cancelled, and I doubt they would yet because that would probably cause a big uproar, but there's no doubt that this post implies a pretty significant chance that solo queue will be cancelled in the foreseeable future. Now it all starts with the fact that Riot promised that solo queue was going to be released a few weeks after Dynamic Queue. Right off the bat, that struck me as something really weird and a huge red flag. It really showed that solo queue was nowhere ready to be released. Because let's be honest, Dynamic Queue wasn't ready to be released at all when it came out in the first place, and had to have its problems ironed out in patches over the next few weeks. Now it's not unlike Riot to release something that just isn't ready and then iron out the kinks later through patches, and it's honestly not actually the worst way of doing things, because it does ensure that we get releases on a reasonable schedule instead of having to wait what feels like forever for the final product, like shoutouts to Blizzard, who tends to do that with their expansions. However, the fact remains that they said solo queue was several weeks away when Dynamic Queue was released with loads of problems already, and that really shows that solo queue wasn't close at all to being developed as a system, and they had a large amount of testing to go before even doing anything with the idea. Now a couple months later, we see that Riot is messing around with the idea of potentially never releasing solo queue at all. Now I personally am actually almost exclusively a solo queue player. Probably around 80 to 90% of the ranked games I've played in Season 6 have been solo queued in the dynamic system, so I can say that without a doubt that if solo queue came out, I would probably play a ton of it. I would enjoy the hell out of it, and the competitive environment in it would be awesome. But with that said, I really like to approach this kind of thing from Riot's perspective, meaning that I want to look at it in terms of what's best for the game as a whole, especially in the long term. Not what's best for myself, and not what I personally would enjoy more, because a big part of my job and what I love to do, which is making videos, relies on the success of League of Legends, so I would much rather prefer that Riot does what's best for the game, rather than what's best for me personally. And with that said, and this is where I'm definitely going to start to get a little bit, or maybe a lot of bit, controversial, I honestly think that no, Riot should not release solo queue. But wait, before you spam that dislike button, hear me out, since I'm sure there's a lot of you guys who disagree with me on that opinion, so I'm gonna do my best to explain my point of view. Essentially, the reason why is because when you boil it down, it's impossible for solo queue and dynamic queue to coexist in the current state that dynamic queue is in. For solo queue to be released in the way that Riot described it, dynamic queue would have to undergo some very serious changes or make some seriously real sacrifices. And that happens for a few reasons. First off, Dynamic Queue requires solo players to function. If solo queue existed, queuing as a team of 4 especially, honestly even 3 or maybe 2 sometimes, would be a nightmare for matchmaking, since people who solo queue would probably never queue into the dynamic system at all. Also, solo queue lessens the value of dynamic queue as a whole, Since the competitive focus will be on a single queue, which would clearly be solo queue, it would honestly become kind of a joke of the community, like how team-ranked Twisted Treeline was in the past. Your ranking in dynamic queue would mean pretty much nothing if solo queue existed alongside it. Nobody would really take it seriously, and that ruins a lot of fun for the people playing that game mode. However, you do have to consider the trade-offs because releasing solo queue would definitely have some positives to it, so it's not fair for me to completely ignore those positives in the discussion. First off, solo queue is without a doubt more competitive than dynamic queue. It would be hands down a better judge of your individual skill as a player overall, since everyone would be on the same playing field. No one gets an advantage from queuing with a good team or anything like that. As well, it would be much better for higher rankings like Master and Challenger, since at that level you could have coordinated teams that are just way too good to be fair, and there aren't enough players for perfect matchmaking either. So you could solo queue for fun with a group of friends and get matched against like TSM or CLG or something ridiculous, and you have pretty much no chance of winning. Solo queue would absolutely make it better for higher ranks. Also, for a small population of the player base, myself included, solo queue would just be a little bit more fun than dynamic queue, since although we don't have the highest rating, we still enjoy the competitive environment and solo queue nature a lot more. A lot of players would prefer to play by themselves to determine their competitive ranking, but you have to understand that the population that would enjoy solo queue more is impossible to measure, and it's probably smaller than you might think, because the dynamic queue system really isn't that bad for solo queuing at all for the vast majority of ranks. People say that dynamic queue doesn't have competitive integrity because you can just queue as a team and get free wins, but that's honestly not the case at all, as are a lot of the other concerns that the hardcore player base has about dynamic queue. Like I said before, many of these problems that existed with dynamic queue have already been solved. Another thing I will mention is that with the way that Riot talks about solo queue, they made it sound like they really did try to make solo queue work. Like they really wanted it to work, but it just came down to this big conflict of solo queue versus dynamic queue, and the fact that it's pretty much impossible for the two to coexist without dynamic queue becoming completely insignificant. And if you're really thinking about the game as a whole, solo queue is like the more niche hardcore version, while dynamic queue is a lot more on the casual fun side. And honestly, when it comes to having a huge player base, it's much better to appeal to the casuals because it just makes up such a larger part of the population. The kicker is that dynamic queue is honestly competitive enough for a ranked ladder experience. Sure, it's not as competitive as solo queue would be, but it holds a ton of merit still, and in my experience this season with a ton of solo queue games, it really has been fine. And I haven't noticed any major differences from my solo queue experience last season. Although people were worried a lot about the advantage of teams, the likelihood is that a team of 4 or 5 will pretty much always match up against another team of 4 or 5, as long as the player base population is high enough, which it is. In the end, queuing as a team doesn't help you win more at all, unless you're in the Master or Challenger levels of play. So for the 99.5% of everyone else, queuing as a team doesn't actually help you gain rank unless people are playing on Smurfs or something. Because even when you queue as a team, they're going to be fair games a vast majority of the time, enough to where the minority is insignificant. The minority is something like 1 game out of 20 or so that you might win simply because you queued with a group. At that rate, getting 1 game in 20 for free, and that's assuming that it's free, it's probably not, you'd have to play around 100 to 150 games to gain 1 division worth of LP for queuing as a team. And that's really not enough for me to see queuing as a team as a significant advantage. So what I'm trying to say is that the problems that the people who want solo queue have about dynamic queue are blown out of proportion, and that the dynamic queue experience for solo queuers is still really good, just about as good as it was last season. I mean, you can honestly measure it. It's literally 4 to 5% worse overall, which sure, when you're in that 4 to 5% it kinda sucks, but overall you really can't say it's that bad. However, if you were to introduce solo queue, dynamic queue would be pretty much ruined. So the trade-off is that 4 to 5% that the solo queuers sacrifice versus the entire dynamic queue system. And for the casual player, having dynamic queue is much better. It's much more fun for that kind of player overall, and having that friends aspect and really promoting and helping that is amazing for the longevity of the game, and that's worth way more than a 4 to 5% trade-off for the hardcore players. You have to realize that we solo queuers are in the minority, and even then the trade-off we make is nothing compared to what the casual experience would have to sacrifice if solo queue was released. The only real significant problem that dynamic queue has in my eyes is the abuse at higher rankings of play, at Master and Challenger, and that's literally something like the top 0.3% of all players. It's less than 0.5% of the player base. But Riot pretty much also said that they were working on fixing the problems that dynamic queue has at the higher ranks. So although that's a problem right now, that might not even be a problem at all a month or so from making this video. Seeing how they fixed so many aspects of the dynamic queue problems already, it's not that difficult to trust that they can fix that too. I study Riot's decisions and design quite a lot, probably more than anyone that I know at this point, and I really do have a lot of faith in Riot as a developer to do what's best for the game as a whole in the long term, and honestly, not releasing solo queue is just that. The biggest mistake Riot made was just promising it in the first place without letting dynamic queue play out. Alright, that just about wraps up my thoughts on this topic. If you disagree with me, feel free to let me know in the comments, I'll definitely be reading them. And if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, but if you think the way I approached the topic needed some work, then you know what, feel free to hit that dislike button. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.